if anyone has any questions, this is a great time to kind of ask. There are no stupid questions, so happy to walk people through anything. P3 Shoe, welcome to class. Yes, we're going to call you right up. Just invited you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, that's step one. Publius, I was wondering, could you just help me get a better understanding of what led to the empty set dollar blow up? I've kind of just heard anecdotally, and I was wondering if you could just help point me to where that resource might be if I'm missing it already, or maybe just speak more about that. That'd be super helpful. Thank you.
Sure. So ESD went through basically two rapid succession growth and debt cycles, and almost never actually stayed at $1. So if we walk through the timeline of events of ESD, and our memory isn't perfect, so bear with me as I try to put the story together in a way that's comprehensive. But ESD started where it had a predefined number of prints. So ESD had epochs, and in order to bootstrap ESD, they had a predefined number of epochs where they basically said every season, or in the Beanstalk case, it's season, so I apologize, but every epoch, the price, no matter how the price is trading on ESD on the market, the Oracle is going to read 1.4. And specifically, the ESD inflation formula was based not off of the liquidity pool, but was based on the market cap when compared to Beanstalk. So if the price was 1.02, the supply would increase 2%. And so the price was 1.4, which meant that the price increased 40% every epoch. And long story short, people thought that after the bootstrap, ESD was going to be worth $1, at least for some time. And if you kind of backtrack that aggressive inflation schedule of 40% every epoch for a couple weeks, that basically created a huge amount of demand for ESD in the short term. But when the printing stopped, there was still a little bit more demand for ESD, and then quickly it went through a debt cycle. And after it went through a debt cycle, and I believe, and I'm sort of making this up, but if I recall correct, it was around 80 million in market cap at that time. It went through a short, like a 2-week debt cycle. And then after the debt cycle ended immediately because, again, the inefficient ESD coupon model that we've talked about in the past made it so that all at once people lent to ESD and the debt cycle ended. But once it ended, then it immediately went into another massive growth cycle, and it never actually hung out at 1. And so then after going through a quick debt cycle, then it went up to 1, above 1, started printing again, grew to a couple hundred million, but never actually hung out at 1. And so it never had a chance to create any utility. It never had a chance to demonstrate any stability. And in practice, it was just like a huge oscillator around 1 that was bound to oscillate wider and wider around 1, not more and more narrow around 1 over time, if that makes sense. So in practice, it started off as a small wave that was set off with a pretty large bootstrap at 1.4, and then that wave was too large, such that it only went through really 2 cycles before it petered out. And one thing we would want to highlight about specifically where Beanstalk is in its current cycle is that basically, excuse me, because Beanstalk is continuing to issue so much debt while the price is at 1, it is going to allow Beanstalk to continuously grow steadily and continue to take in new demand for beans while regularly returning the price to 1. So even if now Beanstalk goes through a pretty consistent growth cycle over the next couple weeks, while the debt is really high, so there's no season of plenty looming, so the price might, in short periods of time, pump above 1. But after, like, because there are so many pods that are going to come harvestable, ultimately the expectation is that beans will continue to oscillate around 1, even if they trend a little bit more on the positive side above 1 during the growth cycle. Continuing to oscillate around the peg is meaningful to stability. And the fact that there's so much outstanding debt also means that Beanstalk isn't going to go through a wild oscillation now where it's just going to grow uncontrollably, because every season that Beanstalk grows, part of that growth comes with paying off debt. That's immediate supply, which can be released on the market, and that can curb short-term inflation. So the expectation is that Beanstalk is going to be able to grow in a much more sustainable way while the price oscillates around 1, as compared with ESD. And if we look at the record, and obviously the smaller market cap of Beanstalk at 20, the low 20 millions right now, it is much smaller than ESD's market cap at a similar point in its lifetime. It launched in late August of 2020 and was a couple hundred million ESD in December, but never repegged after mid-December. So Beanstalk just turned 100 days old this week and is now about a month away from being the longest surviving algo stablecoin that regularly oscillates around 1, that is non-collateralized. And that's pretty exciting that that's potentially around the corner. And if you compare the market caps, Beanstalk seems to be growing much slower than ESD. But if you compare the pod line and the future market cap that is implied by the current debt of Beanstalk, the current market cap of Beanstalk as implied by the pod line is a little over 200 million. So that is sort of competitive with ESD, but the important part is that the price of one bean is at $1, and that's very exciting.
Great. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Where have you been? Were you able to figure out how to unmute? All right, well,
not.
it's going to be a recurring bit, I guess, in today's class.
Oh, we have a hand from AJ. Yeah.
Absolutely. Come on up.
All right, I'm here. Hi, everybody. So thanks for doing this. I also want to say before I ask my question that I do have several questions. So if you guys get for more content and no one else has questions, just feel free to put me back up on stage. I was wondering, why is it important that Beanstalk is willing to issue debt every season, regardless of the price of bean?
That's a great question. Thank you and welcome. The general idea behind being willing to issue debt every season, it doesn't mean that Beanstalk necessarily issues debt every season, but the idea behind being willing to issue debt every season is that it allows Beanstalk to get a much more accurate, consistent sample data for demand for soil. So if we look at how the mechanism works at a high level, Beanstalk adjusts the weather every season based on the price, the debt level, and the demand for soil, and having a consistent data sample for supply, for demand for soil helps facilitate accurate, strong, like what is it allows the model to work in a consistent fashion. Whereas if we compare it to something like the basis model, the idea that you're only willing to issue debt when the price is less than one, well, it's very hard for people to price the debt in the case where you're not offering debt every season. So in Beanstalk's case, if there wasn't soil every season, how could Beanstalk know what the efficient weather is as compared to the current weather? And so ultimately, if Beanstalk goes through extended periods of time where there's no soil and the price is greater than one, Beanstalk isn't going to have the opportunity to figure out whether it should raise or lower the weather. And you may say, well, given that the price is greater than one, the weather should definitely come down. But that type of thing should be reflected in the weather changes. But in general, the idea is that because Beanstalk wants to set the weather or change the weather to be closer to the optimal weather every season, it's important that it has access to the right data to do that. And offering soil every season, even if it's a small amount of soil, allows that to take place. And when we think about the cost of offering a small amount of soil every season, especially during a growth cycle, there's no harm in offering soil because it just means that there's going to be more marginal supply coming due each season because of the interest paid out on the soil. So even if there's no pod line, the soil is ultimately going to be net inflationary in a way that creates immediate supply, and that should help create stability, even if it creates volatility or short-term volatility. It should create stability in the long run in a way that is generally positive for Beanstalk. Meaning Beanstalk isn't going to have an issue issuing lots of debt. Sorry to say issue twice there, but it's not going to have a problem issuing debt during periods where there's high demand for beans and it's growing quickly.
So thank you. Appreciate that. That was really informative.
And we'll definitely get you back up here throughout the class.
Thank you.
JWW, we saw you hopped up here. Did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, well, I apologize. I don't see the ability to just raise my hand to make a request. I think I'm only able to jump on stage. Maybe you guys give me a special microphone or something. But actually, Publius, on that note, could you just walk through one more time the ensuring the marginal supply with the soil that you were just talking about? Just kind of reiterate it one more time.
Can you just clarify what you want me to expand on?
Yeah, just expanding a little bit more on the soil and the pod line relationship. Just, I guess, trying to elaborate more on it would be great.
In general, or just in the context of what I was saying there?
I think in general would be great.
Sure. So what's been exciting to see since BIP2 has passed is that there's been a massive increase in resowing, so people harvesting and instantly resowing, which according to BIP2 was tax efficient or created a more efficient way to do that, at least in theory. And since then, we've seen a massive increase in demand for soil, and the soil went from like close to its maximum level of 5.7 or something based on the supply at that time, and the supply was something like 24 million to now closer to 4 million, maybe a little bit higher than 4 million at this point, 4.2 or 3 last we checked. And that's a general indicator that people that have lent to Beanstalk in the past are interested in relending to Beanstalk. And that's obviously a good signal. But more than that, the fact that soil is being eaten up and the pod line is growing, and while that is happening, there continues to be demand for beans below $1. If we look at what happened over the past day with ETH crashing 8% and beans basically not tipping below 99 cents at all during that dip, because there was so much demand for beans below $1, both demand for soil and demand for stock, meaning demand for depositing assets in the silo. That's pretty exciting. So at a high level, when we analyze what's going on with the pod line, ultimately right now there's almost 100 million pods outstanding and 20 million circulating beans or so, and we're using round numbers. But if we take into account that half of all bean mints are paid out to the field to pod harvest, the fact that there are 100 million pods means that people lending to Beanstalk are currently valuing Beanstalk at 100 million pods times 2 is 200 million plus the current supply of 20, so around 220 million. So when we talk about Beanstalk's growth, on the debt side, people are lending to Beanstalk at like a $220 million valuation. And now, as the pod line continues to grow, because there's still 4 million plus soil, that will mean that people will continue to lend to Beanstalk at a higher and higher valuation. If Beanstalk issues another 100 million soil, which is certainly possible given the weather and the current soil, that will lead to the pod line growing twice as long, and that will lead to the implied valuation by the debt level to be twice as high. And all that does is it allows Beanstalk to grow slowly and steadily into that valuation while the price stays at 1. And so the way that, at least in theory, and obviously this has never happened before in practice, so we're talking about how the model works in theory. Once all the soil is gone, it's actually a great question to answer right after the last question, which is one of the benefits of Beanstalk offering debt every season, once all the soil has been eaten up, is that now Beanstalk can start to gauge very accurately, based on the small amount of soil it issues every season, which you can assume will start to be eaten up, because once all of the current available soil is sown, the idea is that Beanstalk basically will start to deleverage from there. So it will have issued something like 200 million pods, valuing Beanstalk at around 400 million. And then from there, it will start to grow into that valuation. The supply will increase, the debt level will decrease, and a major deleveraging begins. And as Beanstalk grows into that valuation, it will start to pay off pods, start to pay off stockholders, and then it will use the querying of the demand for soil each season, the small amount of available soil that it creates, in order to determine how quickly it can lower the weather. And ultimately, as the deleveraging happens, that will be when Beanstalk is able to aggressively lower the weather. So when we talk about where we're at in the soil and pod line cycle, if we assume that there continues to be good aggressive demand for beans below 1, meaning that Beanstalk doesn't hang out below 1 for an extended period of time and issue a lot more soil, what we would expect to happen is as the current available soil gets eaten up, the pod line will grow extensively. Once all the available soil is eaten up, a major deleveraging begins. Beanstalk will start to lower the weather, and the supply will start to grow more aggressively. The return in the silo will start to become competitive with the pod's return as the pod line continues to grow. And the idea being over time, liquidity will increase in the silo, and the increase in liquidity will lead to an increase in the pods harvesting and the return to stockholders. And between the deleveraging and the increase in liquidity, at some point, a positive feedback loop really starts to take place. So what we've generally been seeing over the past couple days and maybe a week now since the BIP passed was an aggressive move in that direction.
That's really, really helpful and a lot of content to chew on there. Can you elaborate a little bit more, or you can just talk through when you said that the soil being at about 5.7, and I think it's a little bit closer to 4, you said, or 4.2 or 4.3 right now, being a good indicator that people are reinvesting. Can you talk through that piece a little bit more? Because I thought I understood the soil, but I might be missing it.
So if you look at, and this, in order to kind of justify the statement, it requires a little bit more on-chain investigation. But if you look at just the circulating beans, which now are around 700 and something thousand, when BIP2 passed, it was over 2 million and maybe like 2.2 million, if I recall correctly. And based on the transactions that have taken place since then, the vast majority of them they were circulating beans, but they were in the form of harvestable beans, meaning the website displays a harvestable bean not as a pod because it's no longer dead, it's been paid off, but instead it's effectively a circulating bean. And so it's hard to speculate as to exactly why there were so many pods that weren't harvested, beyond a tax reason, right, which was the main reason for the BIP. And we did make, right, the BIP, with the community in mind, because it was an idea that came to us from the community. So for all we know, a lot of the sowers were the people that proposed that idea to us, that reinvested. But basically, there were a lot of transactions that harvested and immediately resowed, and that accounted for a large portion of the soil that was sown into over the past couple days.
Publius, I might go again. Can I ask about the demand side, the demand for Bean? What are the metrics we're looking for adoption by other projects? And I guess can we just get a better idea of timelines there and what the steps look like to success? Thank you.
Sure. So and obviously JWW, if you have more questions, we're happy to answer them at some point during the class. When we compare sort of Beanstalk and the current state of adoption to other stable coins, or what metrics of success might look like, the first thing to state is that it's still very early, and beans have only really been oscillating around 1 for around a month. And so it's a little bit of a difficult sell at this point in time for a lot of protocols to integrate Beanstalk as a stable coin. Now, with that said, there's a lot of integrations that do make sense in the near future that can create more stability. For example, one thing that we've talked about in the Discord a little bit is that we're considering and sort of working on and thinking about it a lot, launching a Bean 3 curve pool. And something like that would both create a large increase in stability because of the ability to arbitrage the Uniswap pool against the curve pool. And you don't really have a loss in decentralization, because at the end of the day, you can still come back to the Uniswap pool if need be. And so you have an increase in stability. But one thing that makes an integration like that a little bit more complex is that if Beanstalk price oracle, and more than just the price oracle, but the general oracle on supply increase doesn't factor in the liquidity in the curve pool, you could have the price at very close to $1 with not a ton of Uniswap liquidity, and accordingly not a lot of minting of soil or beans, but that wouldn't necessarily be efficient. And so one thing that, especially when we're adding another DEX where we expect a large portion of volume to accrue in the near future and it to have a meaningful effect on the Beanstalk price, we would want to incorporate the liquidity in that pool into Beanstalk, and that does require, you know, a non-zero amount of work, and doing it properly is obviously also a little bit more of a complicated endeavor. So we're taking our time to make sure that we do it properly, but that's something in the short term on the integration front that we're working on. And when we talk about other integrations and what sort of metrics for success look like, I think over the next couple of weeks and months, as beans continue to oscillate around $1, it'll be much more natural to pursue integrations and various opportunities for protocols to start using beans once the model really starts to demonstrate long-term stability. So especially as Beanstalk deleverages a little bit and really shows that this model is sustainable and is going to go through another cycle in a sustainable fashion, which would imply that over time it's going to grow to hopefully billions of beans. You know, at some point it becomes attractive for various protocols to be an early integrator into Beanstalk. That can be beneficial to them as well. So there's a balance between being too small, where it's not attractive to them, and being too large, where at some point it's just not in necessarily anyone's interest, other than just because beans are starting to be used everywhere. So there's real demand for it. So when we talk about integrations and partnerships and things like that, that's something that we expect will start to happen more as the price hangs out around 1 over the next couple weeks and months. And we would add that our community has done a pretty good job of getting us connected with various potential integrations, and we would just use this opportunity to reissue a call that if there are integrations that you want to see or can help facilitate, or both, definitely give us a shout in the Discord. And this is all part of a healthy discourse. And speaking factually, the Curve integration was largely inspired by McBean, one of our bean farmers, who suggested that they'd be able to allocate some gauge. So these are things that we're constantly taking feedback from the community into account on where we should be spending our time, and integrations is definitely one of them. But there's a lot of different places that work needs to be done, and integrations is only one of them. So it's a balance of not integrating too much too quickly, while Beanstalk is continuing to work on itself as well.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a pretty clear explanation. Can you just describe, as a follow-on here, the benefit of having the Curve liquidity pool as well? Maybe elucidate that a little bit more would be helpful to me. Thank you so much again for all of this. It's very informative.
Sure. What is it that you want explained? Just for my understanding, just so I can better answer your question.
Additional liquidity tool in addition to Uniswap.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Why do we need a Curve liquidity in addition to the Uniswap?
So right now, if you kind of look at the development of AMMs over time, one thing that has to be given, there has to be an immense amount of credit given to the X times Y equals K model. And Uniswap is a really elegant implementation of that. But at the same time, it's not capital efficient. And accordingly, there's a lot of price movement on even relatively small trades in the BeanETH Uniswap v2 pool. And Uniswap v3 has sort of a unique way of approaching this. They say that anyone can add liquidity at any point on the price curve that they want, but ultimately then there's some drawbacks, like for example, the liquidity tokens for Uniswap v3 are non-fungible, and the price oracle that's native to Uniswap v3 is a little bit less reliable and more manipulable, because anyone can add liquidity at random spots on the curve, and then with a publicly knowable amount of capital immediately drive the price to that place on the curve, and sort of create artificial prices in many cases. And so Uniswap v3 isn't necessarily the best place to construct the core price oracle to Beanstalk, at least at this point in time. And so at this stage of the game, one of the things that is essential is that Beanstalk continues to improve its utility. And in addition to just stability, utility is in part the ability to actually purchase beans at or around $1. And Curve, and specifically Curve Stable Swap, allows a much more efficient way to do that, where you'll have much less slippage on transactions of similar sizes in a similar sized liquidity pool. And that should result in Beanstalk trading much closer to $1. And then the arbitrage opportunity between the Bean ETH Uniswap pool and the Bean 3-curve curve pool will allow the Uniswap pool to trade much tighter to $1 as well, which should create more stability and more utility, which is generally good. And then on top of that, when we talk about integrations, Curve sort of introduces Beanstalk to another massive pool of capital potentially. And there's all sorts of derivatives and complex financial instruments built on top of Curve that once you have a Bean 3-curve pool, lots of different sophisticated players can start to get involved in various capacities, and that's also very exciting potentially. I saw a couple hands raised before.
I brought
I
Bernoulli
can-
Bean up on the stage.
What's up, Bernoulli Bean? I like your username.
Thank you very much. So my question was on the timing for the pod marketplace, because I was just specifically thinking of how, creating an aftermarket for pods, probably might help end the first debt cycle, and that it's going to be a lot more attractive to sell if there's less of a lockup implied with those. So I was just kind of curious what the progress on that project looks like, and if there's any sort of expected date for that to launch.
Well, not to put you on the spot, but in the spirit of decentralized, maybe we could get BeanJoyer, who's one of the leaders on the pod marketplace front, which to date has been totally community led. Maybe BeanJoyer, if you don't mind, kind of coming up and giving a status update to the community on where things are at. But if you don't have a mic or don't want to raise your hand, we're also happy to give people an update ourselves. All right, so BeanJoyer, if you want to hop on, feel free to raise your hand, but we'll start talking. So totally agree. The community has expressed real desire in a pod marketplace. There's sort of a basic V1, which we're working on as we speak, and specifically the community is really leading the way, and we're doing our best to guide them. But there's active development happening, and anyone who's interested in working on that should definitely come hang out in the Dev Pod Marketplace Lab or Dev Pod Market Lab channel, where anyone who's working on the Pod Marketplace can chat. And the general idea behind the V1 is that there's going to be basic exchange functionality. People can list an offer for pods. So if you have pods, you can list them for sale at a given price. And if you want to buy pods, you can issue a standing offer for a place in line at a given price, or any place further up in line. So you kind of can input your max place in line demand as a bid. And that's just going to be a basic V1 that allows people to exchange their pods in a decentralized capacity. But over time, the hope is to develop that into a more sophisticated pod marketplace that allows for more efficient, sophisticated bids and offers. Like if you want to list your plot, right now it has a certain place in line, but as it moves up in line, the price that you want to list your plot for might change. And so you should really be able to enter a function. In theory, it should really be an arbitrary function or close to arbitrary function on how you want the price to change over time, and things like that, where added sophistication that should make for a much more efficient liquid pod marketplace. And obviously you'd be able to input a bid in a similar capacity, but things like that take a little bit more time to develop. And on top of that, one feature that we want to have that is difficult to do in a decentralized capacity is if there's a plot listed and a bid listed, that as the plot line moves up, sort of overlap. They weren't overlapping before, but now as the plot line has moved forward, start to overlap, we do want to have some sort of decentralized clearance system so that even if the buyer or the seller isn't live or watching the market, there's some incentive to clear that trade at the most efficient price for both buyer and seller. So things like that we're actively working to figure out. And we'd love to have more people come and participate on working on the pod marketplace. So anyone who's interested, definitely give us a shout. But in general, this is something that we're working on, and it's hard to give an exact deadline, but hopefully by 2021, by the end of the year, we'll have a very basic decentralized pod exchange going at the very least.
Awesome, thank you. And can we just DM y'all to get added to that channel?
Definitely.
Great, thank you.
Can you guys,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, I'm in transit right now, so it makes it a bit difficult to speak.
No
but
problem. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, no, I'm on a bike, but I can chat really briefly. So there will be a basic V1 hopefully in the upcoming weeks, and that will just entail is the ability to list a plot, and so just post a plot listing with some expiration date, whether that is a time or a place in line. So say if 2 million pods have been harvested, then that will expire automatically. And so we would love feedback as to whether time or pods, like what people would prefer for an expiration date on the plots they'd like to list, and then obviously the ability to buy and see the plots that are listed. Though it still makes sense to handle over-the-counter transactions in the Discord because you don't want to waste gas listing your plots and then having them not get sold. So in theory, you should still, it'll just be a verifiable way to settle transactions because they'll be officially listed. So that's all I wanted to say. And yeah, any Solidity devs or anybody that wants to help out in any capacity, feel free to DM me. So thanks.
Thank you, BeanJoyer, for that update. So, anyone else who's on stage, if you have questions, feel free to chime in or.
All right. Thank you. So let's see. I have a bunch, I have a whole list. Where so I was wondering. This is totally bean related. It's a good question, I think, and it is not related to anything we've been talking about. What is the benefits of having a governance token separate than the liquidity pool token in this silo? And I'll follow that up by saying, because it seems to me that by having the liquidity token contribute be the only way to gain stock, that would help increase liquidity in the liquidity pool. And that's my question. Thanks for letting me ask.
So, in order to answer this, you have to put Beanstalk in the context of what it's trying to do in the grand scheme of things. And if I have US dollars in the form of beans, the most simple use of my US dollars when I'm not using them is to earn passive interest in the silo. And if there was only the opportunity to earn passive interest by depositing LP, then anytime anyone wanted to deposit their circulating beans in the silo, they would either have to match it with ETH or sell half of their beans into ETH, and that creates sell pressure. So the idea is, in order to offer just a basic passive US dollar deposit account where anyone can hold beans, hold their dollars, and earn interest, in order to do that, you basically need to offer stock available for bean deposits in addition to LP deposits.
That makes perfect sense, and that was a super easy answer. Thank you.
I had a quick
Go ahead,
question.
Joplin. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering where I was looking in the white paper and I didn't see it. Maybe I missed it, but where I know that we've had a very fair launch and we don't have a lot of and there's been some discussion of fees or taxes on transactions to try to add to a treasury that have been nixed because we want to keep everything as as fair as possible, which I totally get. And the more that I've thought about it, I think the better that is. The question I had was, where does the treasury that money that comes to reward the season, the calling of the season, and for the small things like, for example, our T-shirts, where does that money come from? And can you talk about the those kinds of budgets and that sort of thing?
Great question. So the money for sunrises is very different than the budgets. New beans, and it's not a predetermined number of beans, are minted every season to incentivize an efficient sunrise call. So you can kind of think about the cost to encourage people to call the sunrise function every hour on Ethereum as a cost of doing business, almost like a net burn of the system. And if you say roughly the cost is 100 beans or $100 an hour, we can even bump it up a little bit, maybe say 150, and there's 24 seasons in a day. We're basically saying 3,600 beans minted per day, and then there's 365 days in a year, so around 100,000 beans. Around 1 million beans a year is the emissions of the system. And in general, when you consider what the burn on, the operating expenses on a bank like, any of the large banks today, $1 million is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of their operating expenses. So that is just the net emissions of Beanstalk to run itself. That's kind of a running cost. And when it comes to the budgets, all of the money that is part of any of the budgets that are currently listed, like on the website, as budget beans. In total, so far, 200,000 beans have been minted for budgets. Those were approved to be minted not according to the normal supply issuance by the silo, by all of the stockholders. And in practice, those beans were just minted out from the BIP. And the reason this model of creating beans once is, in our opinion, the best way to do this is because it obviously, at the time the beans are minted, there's an increase in the supply. So in some regards, there's dilution of the bean supply. But it's important to realize, A, that dilution is approved by the stockholders who are entitled to earn beans from future inflation. So they're diluting themselves and they're delaying pod harvest slightly at the margin. But the reason it's an elegant way to do it is in practice, it's a one-time cost. And there's no other cost ever borne by the system other than things that are approved by stockholders. So if you compare this way of creating funds for budgets with something like 1% of all withdrawals are kept by Beanstalk in a treasury or something like that, it just creates a drag on the system and it creates friction within the system that is permanent. And the reason that the budgets are not deposited in the silo is if you mint 1% of the bean supply, which 200,000 beans is close to 1% of the bean supply, and you deposit all of that in the silo, there's like 20 million beans deposited in the silo right now. You're basically diluting all the stockholders permanently by 1%. And then you basically have a permanent tax. So instituting a tax at the protocol level is de facto the same as minting beans one-off and then depositing them in the silo. So the way that we'd like this to be done and ensure that there's the minimal amount of inflation to pay for things from the DAO exclusively is that any beans are minted once through a BIP that is very specific as to the use of the beans.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. That's a really good answer. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And we would just use this as an opportunity to encourage everyone to ask weird questions too, like that one that might not seem to be appropriate. They're perfectly appropriate. So anything that's on your mind, this is a great opportunity to ask it. And as we have a couple more minutes here until we wind down class, we would use this opportunity to encourage anyone to ask it. Yeah, one more. And we have JWW, and then we're going to invite Just Use a Pen as well. But J-Dubs, what's up?
Yeah, my apologies. Didn't mean to jump the line. But really quick, can you just give an update? I haven't been able to follow the Discord how the BeaNFT conversation's going. I know there was chatter about like maybe an LP side forward for the winter or something like that. I don't know if there's any kind of an update that you can share, or if that's just being driven by the community.
So we had hoped, and this was kind of the running bit about where have you been not being able to speak for some reason, but they were supposed to be here at the beginning to kind of give a little bit of an update, but we've spoken with them and they seem to have a couple really good ideas about the BeaNFTs and are interested. They seem like a little bit more on the art side and the game side of the BeaNFTs, and obviously we understand the protocol side of it, and they've expressed an interest in leading the charge there. And the last we heard from them, they were drafting some sort of proposal, but we don't have much more substance there. I know that the idea being discussed is that there would be, similar to sowing beans last time. In this case, it would be probably some sort of incentive for sowing LP, and the hope would be to have the BeaNFT winter event coincide with the addition of a BIP for POL, for protocol on liquidity, where people can start to sow LP to Beanstalk in exchange for pods. So that's an idea that we've been working through and think is generally pretty economically sound and will create more efficiencies for Beanstalk. And POL seems like, in general, the way that DeFi 2.0 is going, and we don't think that there's any problem with POL in this case. And our original objection was our concern that if the POL had stock and seeds, then it would be a tax on people, as we were sort of just discussing. But the idea here is that the POL would not own any stock and seeds and would just be permanent liquidity. So not sure if I have much more to add on the BeaNFTs, but that's that's sort of where our head is at, and hopefully we hear more from Where Have You Been, and maybe we get a proposal from them soon. Obviously, the holidays are around the corner, so this is something that we want to get a move on sooner rather than later. And on the artist front, the artist who did the BeaNFT V1s, who thus far would like to remain anonymous, has, they've been working on the website, and so our hope is to hire them to do the BeaNFT V2s as well. And we will probably be proposing a marketing proposal or maybe a development proposal shortly to hire that artist to work on sort of a next version of the website, which they've been doing, and we want to continue to have them do in a more efficient, more full-time capacity, and then additionally as well, hopefully funding their work on the BeaNFT V2s through another proposal. So that's a little bit about what's going on. Wendy, what's up? Nice to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me. Just got a quick question about your Oracle situation. Have you ever looked into using your Chainlink Oracle, considering what happened to Maker and Compound and BZX with their exploits?
Well, there's a lot to be said about Chainlink. The short answer is, over time, as Beanstalk moves across chains, there may need to be a need to leverage Chainlink, but at this stage of the game, the fact that Beanstalk is native to Ethereum and is able to construct an Ethereum native price oracle means that there's no need to add Chainlink in the middle. And in the case of Chainlink, your specific oracle is only as decentralized as the number of nodes that are supplying data on your data point. And in the case of the Beanstalk price oracle, at this point in time, it's much more decentralized just to query the Bean price from the decentralized exchanges on Ethereum where Beans trade. But over time, as we move to a cross-chain implementation, we may need to start to leverage Chainlink, but it's much less decentralized than just doing things, directly through Ethereum, certainly.
Yeah, awesome. So no chance of flash loan attacks with this one?
Well, there's a couple things to keep in mind here. One is there's a couple different flash loan attacks. Any flash loan that happens over the course of one block, or even 2 blocks or 3 blocks, is not going to have a meaningful effect on the TWAP price. And specifically, the bean supply and soil supply is changed every season based on the TWAP bean price each season. And it's very difficult to manipulate the Uniswap V2 TWAP through a flash loan attack in general. And the other thing to note is, as protocols start to integrate beans into their protocol, that is actually a different question. And one thing that we might want to consider doing is, through a BIP, adding a couple of different bean price oracles sort of native to the Beanstalk contract, so that other protocols can query the bean price in the most decentralized way, where even a flash loan that drives the price of one bean up to $10 or $100 one block doesn't expose other lending protocols. So ultimately, those would be issues with the lending protocol, but the way to ensure that they integrate beans in a way that is resistant to those types of attacks can be facilitated by Beanstalk adding sort of integration-friendly oracles, which is something we're actively thinking about and working on internally and thinking about what are sort of the best oracles we want to promote other people to use for various use cases. So one reason why the current Beanstalk price oracle isn't sufficient is it calculates a TWAP for each season. And so at the very beginning of each season, right after the sunrise function is called, if a lending protocol is valuing the price of beans based on the season TWAP, well, the season TWAP is highly manipulable at the very beginning of a season, which doesn't affect Beanstalk anyway, because it uses the TWAP over a full season, but could affect a protocol that was using the season TWAP in real time. So these are real things that need to be considered, and we're certainly actively considering them and working on not necessarily fixes, but more solutions to these issues that are very natural to DeFi. But they're top of mind, and they become more complex as stock and seeds become liquid. But all of that is going to be handled and figured out in due time. But this is one of the reasons why it's important that there's a lot of time, energy, and resources spent on developing Beanstalk, because there's a lot of work to be done on this front.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. Glad to be hanging around.
Glad to have you here. Just use a pen. Welcome to class, and maybe you'll be our last question since we've already run a little over an hour.
Yes, and apologies for coming late. I just wanted to, because when I had brought up earlier in the day the Solana implementation, a number of people had different kind of thoughts on that in kind of different forums that I'm in, and I just figured since we were already talking about it, if you had any thoughts that you could share, and if you already talked about it in this classroom, don't feel the need to rehash it because of me.
No, it's no problem, and we haven't spoken about a Solana integration. So for context, just use a pen. Hit us up today, and from your question, it seems like we're also chatting in the chat about this, which I guess we missed. But the chatter and the question was about, have we considered a Solana integration? So in order to answer this, first we have to kind of put this in the context of our thoughts on a layer 2 integration and cross-chain integrations. So we've been thinking about how to add Beanstalk contracts on other chains and layer 2 chains that are not competitive to the main Beanstalk and instead are able to leverage the current credit history of Beanstalk in order to have the same stability the original Beanstalk and beans on the main chain. And a couple of economic principles that will facilitate that are that the beans are fungible across chains. So one bean on one chain is the same or can be exchanged for one bean on another chain. And that rule in and of itself effectively creates an arbitrage opportunity where now the value of one bean on any chain is ultimately dependent on the credit of the main chain. And the way that Beanstalk will work on multiple chains is that you can deposit assets into the silo on any chain, and you can sow assets in the field on any chain, but the weather and the interest rate paid out to stock are going to be constant across different chains. And so on the one hand, that becomes a very economically compelling solution that is scalable to L2, is scalable across other chains. But the complexity that comes with that is you do need to have decentralized bridges that allow you to go back and forth between different chains and have the various Beanstalk contracts on different chains speak to one another. And that is not trivial to do, and it's certainly not trivial to do across multiple chains. So it is going to require a significant development effort to make that happen. But in general, it seems like the economics of L2 are more or less figured out. And the main holdup at this point in time is really just resources and developers to actively kind of start building bridges that are necessary to facilitate that.
And do you think Solana is like a good first option to go after, or have you had other other thoughts on that?
Well, Solana is a great option mainly because it's a very different pool of capital than Ethereum. And I think you could make a compelling argument that if Beanstalk can become the leading algo stablecoin on Ethereum and Solana, it's very well poised to also become the leading algo on any other blockchain that sort of takes a lot of user adoption or has a lot of user adoption in the future, which is very exciting. But at the same time, Solana is particularly complex because you can't compile the Solidity code for Solana, and basically it's non-trivial to implement Beanstalk in Rust, and it would require a significant development effort. And so this is something that we'll definitely be working on in the future and as Beanstalk grows. But it's definitely not the easiest layer 2 or cross-chain integration because it's not so simple to do to do Beanstalk or to implement Beanstalk on Solana at this point.
Got it. Thank you so much for addressing that here. And yeah, we'll talk more about it.
Our pleasure. So maybe if there's any lingering quick questions, we'll take one or two more if people have them that are urgent, or otherwise we will encourage everyone to wait. We have one more question, and that'll close us out. And then we encourage everyone to come to the DAO meeting that's basically in 2 days from now. So AJ Pico.
Yeah, it's close. It's Pikel.
Pickle.
Yeah, it's not a real name. It's anyway. Have you written? So you talked a little bit about your vision for what the market cycles might look like, and like you talked about the deleveraging, and then you also talked extensively tonight about I think it was called, and this is new to me, a flash loan problem. And you know, if you've written about those things in any blog post, or if there's any other resources where you've sort of either outlined your vision or talked about this pressing issue that Beanstalk faces, I would be totally into reading about them. Or if you know, if there's other sources that are good to read about, that'd be cool. And I mean, obviously, that question is for anybody who is knowledgeable about those subjects. But yeah, just they're
Great question. We would just use this opportunity to highlight at this point in time, there's not any immediate vulnerabilities to Beanstalk. Certainly, like that's just on the flash one side a fact because there's no lending protocols that currently have beans. So the mechanics of a flash loan attacker that someone can borrow a large amount of assets from a lending protocol, and as long as they return the same amount within the same transaction, they can do whatever they want with them. Because beans are not on any lending protocols today, there's nothing to worry about on that front. But in general, Beanstalk is already resistant to those types of attacks. The concern would be protocols that integrate a bad oracle on top of Beanstalk that might have issues. But definitely important to keep in mind, and that is top of mind on our end. And more reading materials. There's a ton of helpful links in the Start Here channel. And I believe Bean Merchant has been putting together some sort of FAQ or something somewhere. So maybe he can direct people to that as well at some point. but there's lots of materials, and we're having weekly discussions like this so people can continue to learn about how the system works. So this has been an immensely successful class. Glad to have more people hanging out in the speaking room and participating. It's very exciting to see such a thoughtful, curious, intelligent community sprouting around Beanstalk, and everyone who wants to get involved, definitely come hang out in the Beanstalk Farms category in general DAO, or put your skill sets and skill set volunteer, and we're just getting started. So this is all very exciting. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll talk to hopefully some of you on Thursday for the DAO meeting, and otherwise hopefully we'll see everybody next week for class.